funny how you can use a shovel to dig up another shovel. Look at this thing. It's the old-fashioned, like, flat, wide shovel. So I think we're in the right place. Back in 1865, William Gsell and his wife Maria Burkhart Gsell moved here to a farm, and they brought with them 15 kids. So these people were Mennonites, right? And so the Mennonites kept accurate records. They're really proud of themselves and proud of their communities and their families. So there's history books telling us stories in detail about who they were, where they came from, and what they did. There's so much disappointment in metal detecting. There's lots of disappointment. But in case you're wondering, you ever wonder how artifacts are dated? Like this aluminum can right here, that's from the 80s. But in any case, if you find a stone artifact, oftentimes there's charcoal mixed in the ground around it, because that's where people had their camps and their campfires and stuff. And so this right here, since it's made out of carbon, can be radiocarbon dated. So if you find arrowheads mixed in with charcoal, you can use charcoal to figure out how old the arrowheads are. But lots and lots of disappointment in metal detecting. So this Mennonite history book tells us that the very first thing that this family did when they moved here in 1865 was to build a bank barn. Now, a bank barn is a barn that's built on a hill, and it has an upper level at the top of the hill and a lower level at the bottom of a hill. It's a great place to utilize a hill that's inconvenient. And so if you look out over here, you'll see that this is the hill. I mean, this is where you would build a bank barn. So let's detect and see what we can find. I wonder what that could be. It's got a high tone. Yeah. Yeah, every time I see something like this, it turns out to be like the inside of a clock. Yeah, so this is where the bank barn would have been, and there was lots of activity around here. And this right here, when I swung the coil, gave such a weird signal because it's two different types of metal together, and it confused the metal detector, but it looks like a homemade tool, kind of. So if you look at this right here, it's like a piece of iron. It's like an iron nail wrapped up inside like some type of like tin or copper or something. It looks to me like this might have been a homemade scratch awl. So a scratch awl is what a carpenter would use to make marks in the wood. "16 kids here." And so I could just imagine kids like running up and down the hill, rolling down the hill, fighting, roughhousing, screaming, arguing, playing, everything up and down this hill. Kids are drawn towards hills, so I imagine that there's stuff here that has to do with kids. So let's go check out this next find. Check this out right here. This find right here is just precious. Absolutely wonderful. It gave me a really good signal because it was flat and wide. So I'm very happy with this. Nice harmonica reed. And this one is so short and fat to what I usually find. And so that's got to be from a kid. These things must have been cheap and plentiful because metal detectorists, we find a lot of these. You know those old-fashioned overalls that had the pocket right here in the middle? And I think what happened is that, you know, kids had these harmonicas because they were cheap, and so they would put the harmonica in the pocket in the middle of the overalls, and then they would start wrestling and doing rough and tumble stuff, and the harmonica would get thrown out. It would get lost in the tall grass because they didn't have good lawnmowers back then, and 130 years later we find these with metal detectors. These kids would have been able to speak German because they came from Pennsylvania, where people still speak German in the United States. And I know that because Sunday school in the history book was listed as German Sunday school and English Sunday school. But over time, the German that they spoke slowly evolved into something that modern day Germans would hardly understand. And the answer is this right here. That's how that happened. You see, since they were cut off from the motherland, whenever there was anything new that happened, like an invention of a harmonica or something, it was given an English name. Because they were cut off from mainland Germany, there was no German name for this. So as more and more technology came into being, the old German that they spoke became heavily contaminated with English words. And if you listen to someone from Pennsylvania that speaks this old German, you can hear so many English words in it. And so Americans can probably understand more of what they're saying than the actual Germans from Germany. The base of the hill, and this is like the perfect place for stuff to come bouncing off the wagon as the horses went up the hill towards the barn. William Gsell was a farmer. That was his trade, and so I imagine that this was his. It looks like it was some kind of old farm equipment pulled by horses, you know. This family had 16 kids, and I've done this before where I've detected some place that had a huge amount of kids and you don't find any buttons, you know. How is it that 16 kids grew up here and you don't find one single button? This metal detector right here is like the entry level type of thing, and it's good, but there's no way that 16 kids grew up here and didn't drop any buttons. I just can't find them with this thing because they're probably too deep, or I don't know. What I really need is the AT Pro, right? Which is we'll find 90% of what's in the ground, you know. Sometimes some of the things I find are chilling, kind of. If we could get this to ring again, that would be amazing. Here we have a harness bell, and that's a bell that was on the horse harness. And that says something interesting about them, because you wouldn't buy this and put it on your horse unless you had enough money. It's like the farm that they had generated enough revenue for them to buy things like harness bells and harmonicas. Look at this. This is every bit of 1860s. It's bent and it's asymmetrical and it's handmade, and it looks like a hitch pin. It's a hitch pin, right? So like you hook wagons together with it. And this, I don't know how you make one of these, but this looks homemade because it's so weird shaped. But the family, the men, would have been out there working in the fields, like all those wheat fields out there, and they would have been like stacking the wheat and loading it into wagons, and then they would come up this hill right here and they would put it in the barn. Now these things are easy to find with a metal detector because they're round and they give off a really good signal, but that's really old right there. There's the road right there, so I imagine when horses would come up the road, they would get to the base of this hill. And when they got to the base of the hill, the wagons would bump and stuff would roll out of the wagons. And so this is a horse bit. So when this Gsell family first moved here in 1856, the nearest Mennonite church was 20-something miles away. And when they went to church, they used to load the kids up into the wagon, and they'd all make this huge trek to the next 2 towns over to get to church. And can you imagine what it was like to have 16 kids and just have a wagon load of kids You know, and how much work it took for the mother, Maria Burkhart, to get all the kids ready for church and wash all those clothes and then load everybody up in the wagon and go bumping down the road for 20-something miles. Can you imagine, like, the bickering and the fighting and the arguing and what's for lunch and all that stuff? So they must have had a handle on that, because that would be like torturous if you didn't have kids that minded you